Hi all, welcome back. So, Gangs of New York, what did you think? I'm curious to know. I'll be checking in on your discussion posts and seeing what you think of this film. People tend to either love it or hate it. I usually preface it when it's face to face in class that I will be cutting out some sections and I and I fast forward or delete the get rid of what I find the nauseating love scenes between Leonardo DiCaprio and Cameron Diaz. There's a lot of stuff in there we don't need from a historian's perspective. Absolutely don't. And but in any case, yeah, what we're interested in is whether it works as history, not those other sub themes that don't matter. And yeah, there's quite a bit in here that does, I think, and that's where we're going to go today. So. But why I like it, what I love about it, is it really makes you scratch your head and go, "What the heck? Is this even remotely possible for what this period would have looked like?" And it reminds me always of that quote: "The past is a foreign country; they do things differently here, there." And this is what Palmer gets at in his article that you're reading about. Could it have been so wild? And what Gangs of New York does is it says it's not patriotism, it's not ideas, it's not great men. It's really class conflict that's the engine driving history. This is the story. And by the way, we've forgotten this story. We've whitewashed those antebellum cities. We've sugar-coated the past. We've seen the revolution without the bloodshed, without the class conflict. We've seen the Civil War without the draft riots, right? And so let's bring back that color. Let's show how it actually happened. And this is intentional based on what Scorsese came to believe about the time. And he wrote a book about it in 2003 called Gangs of New York, The Making of the Movie. And he said, yeah, the film, by extension me, I sees the period as being a cauldron of conflict and violence out of which New York and the country were created. Okay? And this is, so that is what Scorsese is trying to do. Not just his own take, this blood-soaked version of American history. He hired a historian who wrote a book about the 5 points. His name is Tyler Anbender. So he hired him, Tyler Anbender, a historian, to review the script. But he bases it on the other hand, his inspiration came from came from a book of the same title, Gangs of New York, which goes back to 1928, and it's by a guy named Herbert Asbury, and it's a gang full of it's pulp fiction kind of. What Asbury did for antebellum cities or Civil War era cities is he is kind of the same thing that Karl May does with the American West for the German audience, is he ramps everything up by a fair degree. And and it wasn't. He wrote a series of books. Another one was called The Gangs of San Francisco. I believe there are a couple others as well. But with Gangs of New York, we get his that theme of that wild exaggerations. He said in 1855 in this book, he says that there were 30,000 gangs in New York City, some with 1,000 members. It would have been there would have been more gangs than there are people in New York at the time, physically impossible. But in any case, lurid tales and but also a lot of Scorsese in here. Okay, and that the book and the film deal in machismo, and that's Scorsese's big thing, right? And you've seen it in Raging Bull, Goodfellas, and he's best at ethnic subcultures, right? Which is consistent with his own Sicilian heritage. In any case, conflict is where it's at. In uh, this is like with a lot of historians that class affiliation explains pretty well everything. This is why Palmer likes the film so much, because it restores that 1960s view of things when labor Marxist historians are taken more seriously. Okay, and really what this is it's Howard Zinn history. Okay, Howard Zinn history. Zinn is a World War II vet, social activist, playwright, historian, super famous. If you haven't heard his name before, you will soon. Famous enough to get a cameo on The Simpsons. I mean, there you go. Uh, say no more. Uh, this is the guy. If you watch the movie Good Will Hunting, where Matt Damon, it tells Robin Williams what kind of books he likes, and he says it's the ones that tell the real stories, like People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, the kind of thing that will knock your socks off, right? And he likes it because they connect with his story, which is working class south side of Boston. Okay? And maybe you remember that scene, maybe not. Anyways, if you haven't been introduced in, you'll hear his name everywhere now. And died very recently, and probably more famous than ever. In Howard Zinn's view, is very much what we get in this film from Scorsese. And if you read the introduction to the People's History of the United States, you'll really understand what I'm talking about. This is radically bottom-up history. Okay, and here's what Zinn says, and I'll just I put a quote here from his introduction, and I normally play. Matt Damon does an audiobook of Howard Zinn, so you can listen to him online, which is great. In fact, there's a whole bunch of stuff out there of different Hollywood actors that are Zinn enthusiasts that have done readings of his book that you can access. So there's your audiobook challenge for you. But in any case, here's an intro. It says, nations are not communities, never have been. There's no such thing as the United States. He really believes that. The history of any country that conceals the conflicts of interest doesn't get it right. Okay? And those conflicts are major, right? And he says, it is the job of thinking people, as Albert Camus suggested, not to be on the side of the executioner. So in the telling of history, it's our duty not to be on the side of the executioner. And he goes on about how he does his history, and it is radically bottom up. He says, in the inevitable taking of sides, which comes from selection and emphasis in history, which we know, I prefer to tell the story of the discovery of America from the viewpoint of the Arawaks, from the natives that Columbus discovered. And then he goes on to say, to tell the Constitution from the history of the Constitution from the standpoint of the slaves, of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokees, of the Civil War as seen by the New York Irish, of the Spanish-American War as seen by the Cubans, of the First World War as seen by socialists, and of the Second World War as seen by pacifists, and on, right? And then he says, and so on, to the limited extent that any one person, however he or she strains, can see history from the standpoint of others. So this is his goal, this is his agenda, and he's very clear about it, that we are to be, not to be on the side of the executioners, and that really history is not about ideas of nations, right? And a corrective for the dead white man history, this myth of governing ideas, and this myth that you could tell the story of a nation through the leaders, right? He says, no, you have to be radically bottom up. This is how we understand history. History, it happens through class conflict, right? Conflict is the engine that drives history. And that's absolutely what this film is telling us. That's 100% what this film is telling us. So let's look at that, and let's look at the different themes that work or maybe not work so great. And I'll look at 4 of them, and then we'll talk more about the theses and what I think of this interpretation of the Civil War of New York at this time period. And in many ways, it really nails it. It does a good job. And one is in the Civil War draft riots, the Civil War and the draft riots. Okay, so for this, we have to understand that the Civil War is a war of attrition. And we've probably mentioned this before with Birth of a Nation, 600,000 warded. Civil wars always last much longer than other wars. And we see that with Syria right now, and they're often just bloodbaths. They're the worst in terms of body count. This is complicated by the fact that what happens here is the Industrial Revolution has taken place, and Americans haven't had a war since then, and what they find out is frontal assault doesn't work so good. And this lesson really comes home at Antietam, which is really the end of the frontal assault, the end of that idea of heroism and just charging against enemy lines and getting mowed down. This is what happens there with the Gatling guns that are in one day we have a casualty rate of 23,000. Okay, and a couple things come out of that. One is the Emancipation Proclamation follows 5 days later, partly because of Lincoln's, largely because of Lincoln's religious conversion experience after the death of his son, and he writes his own letters to himself that he didn't think would ever see the light of day, where he starts seeing that he is an agent of God in this conflict, that it has to have a higher purpose if all these men are dying, and that higher purpose is emancipation. But it's also a very calculated war strategy, wherein wherein he says that as of January, any state that is still in rebellion, those slaves will be emancipated. So the paradox here is that the slaves that are actually under Lincoln's command, under his control already in the border states, will not be liberated, only those in the rebel states, because that serves to get them out of the war faster, because their slaves will be a threat against them once they know they're emancipated. They'll be doing everything they can to kill their master and get to Union lines. Okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation comes out of this. Let's hasten the end of the war, free the slaves, completely change the direction of the war, though, right? The intent of the war was not an extension of slavery to the West. Now it's about the abolition of slavery. Okay? So fascinating for that reason. But it also comes out of this new sense that this is a war of attrition, and we've already seen the U.S. The Union Army is taking in younger and younger boys and older men, but Lincoln realizes he's going to have a draft, okay? A Civil War draft comes out of this as well. So Antietam is a real watershed. Now, students of history probably know that both the North and the South had a draft. The South had one early on because it is vastly outnumbered 4-1 in terms of manpower. Not in terms of passion and energy, though. But it also has, in its Enrollment Act, it has that proviso that if you have 20 slaves, you don't have to serve, which feeds into that idea of rich man's war, poor man's fight. Watch the movie Cold Mountain. It's a pretty good, it's a rare movie in terms of showing, kind of getting at that divide. Okay. But the Enrollment Act that Lincoln passes is very controversial because it's never been done, and it's not. Congress is not at all certain that the Constitution will allow for the federal government to force people to fight against their will, but it's needed, so it's brought in. It runs to 38 sections, and the most controversial by far is substitution and commutation. Now these come in because a good part of those who found America are Quakers, right? Very early on, after the Pilgrims and Puritans, come the Quakers, the dissenters, the first dissenters in America. They're Christian pacifists who believe you may not fight, that it's against their religion, simple as that. And so to allay those forces in an already controversial act, we have substitution and commutation. Now, substitution is pretty clear. What it is you can get somebody else to fight for you. Okay, and so unbelievable, but yes, and Andrew Carnegie is a great example of this. Okay, he's 27 years old when the war begins, self-made man, allegedly, captain of industries, one of these robber barons of the Gilded Age, and he survives the Civil War because he goes and gets a draft broker. Okay, so if you don't want to fight, you find someone who's a draft broker, and his job is to get one of these poor Irishmen coming off the boats and offer them some money in order to fight in the war, and for somebody else. His job also is to make sure that Patrick O'Donoghue or whatever shows up for muster, because often these Irishmen will take that money and run. So you want to get a draft broker to make sure it works, but it's expensive, right? $830 is what Carnegie pays for his certificate of non-liability, which means he doesn't have to fight, and that's what a New York City policeman makes at this time period. Okay, of course, they make a great deal more because they're because the police are taking money every which way they can. But in any case, it's a whole lot more, probably twice as much as what a general laborer makes at the time, right? So it's beyond the means of most people. Definitely the working class. Okay? Now, commutation is where the federal government then decides, because of the corruption involved with substitution and the problems involved and the price going up and up, that it's defeating its original purpose. Plus, the money is simply going to draft brokers. So let's cash in on that ourselves. Federal government passes what's called commutation. And by that, you get a certificate of non-liability simply by paying Congress $300, which is very useful for the prosecution of the war, which is very expensive. And it also serves the purpose of substitution. Okay, so you simply pay to not have to fight. All right, and that comes up in the film very clearly. This and the idea that of how it's received by the working class, whether you're north or south, right? So, a big section of northern opinion, and by this point, New York is 25% Irish, and a whole lot more poor immigrants than just the Irish, a lot of German recent arrivals as well, and they hate this, right? They hate this, and plus they have no interest in the freedom of the slaves anyway. The Civil War, what the whole purpose of it, because it will simply increase their competition for very scarce jobs, and it will drive down their wages, which is absolutely accurate. That is absolutely what will happen when 4 million more slaves are freed. Right, and that comes up in the film too, where Daniel Day-Lewis says that in very graphic terms that I won't repeat. But and we get it from the time period. Here's Maria Liddick Daly. She's a big, I call her influencer. Of course, that term isn't used back then, but she writes this diary of a Union Lady, and it goes viral. It goes through a lot of printings and is widely read. And she talks about life in New York during the Civil War, which is a fascinating place to be during the war, and she's up there in the elite wife of a New York judge, and she points that out, right? This is what the Irish say. They say they're sold for 300, while they pay down in the South, they'll pay 1,000 for Negroes. That's how much we're worth, 300, right? Because that's what it would take to get out of the fight, and that's what our bodies are worth. We're thrown into this fight that we don't even want or agree with, and that will work against our interests. Rich man's war, poor man's fight couldn't be more clear in that, and the film does a great job with that. Okay. And this is what leads to the draft riots, of July 1863. Now, the draft riots is not, it happens in the context well, first they start in Wisconsin, then Philadelphia, and then New York. And happens in the context of the New York militia being called out to Gettysburg, and we have that big battle, the closest that the Southern forces, that the Confederacy gets into the north, their furthest north incursion, and that is Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Okay. A major battle, right? Major battle, multiple days, huge casualty rate, and the New York militia is called out, leaving New York defenseless, fairly defenseless. And shortly after that Union victory, a draft is held because of the huge body count. A draft is held in New York. Okay, so anyone who can't get out of commutation and can be located and doesn't take off, which happens in goodly numbers, ends up being drafted, the poorest of the poor. Okay, and this is what triggers the draft riots, which is just this brutal 5-day rampage in New York, and it happens in other cities, as I said. And who the New Yorkers are targeting, and often it's the gangs, is the African Americans, because they're the symbol of who they don't want, of what they're not about, right? Their emancipation. But they're also, this is one of those rare instances of a nascent class war, right? Where the homes of the affluent, like the Scammerhorns, who are depicted in the film, and the Rockefellers and whatnot, are attacked. Okay, so they're coming out of the slums and they're attacking the homes of the affluent. They're also going after their factories, right? After the manufacturers. And George Opdyke, who's known to become very, very rich during the war. And people like Andrew Carnegie are very rich during the war, selling steel. But George Opdyke is a great symbol because he's selling really shoddy uniforms to the Union side and making a lot of money off it. So the ultimate war profiteer, and his factory is destroyed. The Colored Orphan Asylum is attacked and burned down, and African Americans are dragged out and lynched. Okay, in numbers that we don't really know, and the death toll is like a lot of death tolls for this time period is very unclear. Anywhere between 120. The range of dead among historians ranges from a low of 120 to even 2,000 killed. So that's the draft riots. Again, African Americans being singled out, since from the Irish perspective, blacks are being emancipated on the backs, on the bodies of Irish American recent arrivals. We have no quarrel with slavery anyway. In fact, the opposite. We fear the competition of freed slaves. Okay, so the film does a great job with that, I think. Another theme, second theme we'll look at, municipal corruption. Tammany Hall, played very well by Jim Broadbent, so let's get into that. What is Tammany Hall? Well, Tammany Hall is an actual hall that houses the New York Democratic political machine, and it did for a very, very long time. This goes back to post-revolution. Aaron Burr was part of the Tammany Hall machine in the early days. Political organizations are called political machines, and largely they exist through corruption and graft and the control, the corrupt control of a certain segment of the electorate. In this case, it's the working class Irish, poor Irish and Germans, largely Irish. That Tammany Hall Democratic Party, which is housed there in an actual hall in New York, controls the immigrant vote through a variety of ways, through paying them off and whatnot. Okay, so they can bring the vote, and it's gangs that bring the vote the way to Tammany Hall's way. Okay, very clearly depicted in the film. Okay, so Tammany Hall corruption. And that term Tammany Hall corruption still exists today. You hear of it sometimes of simply of corrupt municipal politics, and those are always the most corrupt, and often that's because police are integrated in North America as opposed to in Europe generally. The police and the municipalities operate together in tandem. And we'll talk more about that when we do Changeling, and we talk about police corruption in America and the long history of that. Boss Tweed was the notorious head of Tammany Hall for a critical period, and probably the apex of corruption. Of Tammany Hall corruption happens under him, under his reign. And by the way, Tammany Hall exists right up until the 1930s when Franklin Delano Roosevelt takes them on and dismantles them. Until then, they're very powerful, and not just at the municipal level, at the state level as well. Okay, so William Tweed was a Democratic congressman from New York. He's also a senator. Of the state of New York, and head of public works of New York City. Now, with these multiple offices, he managed to do a whole lot of damage. And him, together with the mayor, Fernando Wood, and Tweed's brother, and one other individual are known as the Ring, okay, the Ring. And together they control the municipal police in New York. They arrange the sale of political appointments. So if you want an office, any kind of political office in New York City, you can pay them for it. You can pay upwards of $50,000 for it, which you want to do because it's a license to print money. Once you have a political appointment, you can sell business licenses, right? You can sell public works contracts. You can have a lot of people grease your palms because you are the authority that can that hands out the permits, right? They also businesses at this time also are paying into Tammany Hall for police protection because the Ring, the Tammany Hall Ring, controls the municipal police. Okay, and so just out and out extortion of this type, right? And these are fun guys. Under them, a new courthouse was built for New York City, and that's mentioned in the film. He talks about Jim Broadbent plays Boss Tweed brilliantly, right? He does an awesome job, but he talks about, oh, well, we're going to have a New York courthouse. It'll be a modest affair. It ends up costing twice as much as the Alaska Purchase because all the money goes sideways into their pockets, okay? So any public works project is going to be super expensive under these guys, and they are the ones on the take and handing out to others that are their minions, okay, and keeping control over everything. So profiteering, big time, okay? So this is Tammany Hall corruption, and the film does a really good job of that. I think it does about the best you can. Now, given the limitations of film in general, but in any case, how Boss Tweed is done by, and that also is it's not shown in the film, but the film does a great job of showing the Thomas Nast cartoons of the Tammany Hall Ring, and these are really important. Okay, so let's look at that now. Thomas Nast, he's this illustrator for Harper's Weekly, which is this very important magazine that exists, a news information magazine that exists for many years, and is widely read in New York and also across the country at this time. Illustrated News is the big thing. Punch out of the UK, maybe you've heard of that, is another example. But in any case, Thomas Nast is anti-Tammany Hall, and he uses his illustrations pages to to give that not so subtle message of what they're about, right? That they got their thumb on New York, they're vultures. Boss Tweed is that's one of the more famous one. That one of Boss Tweed, this overweight Boss Tweed with his head being a sack of money, right? Now these are more important than we think, cartoons then, compared to today, because so many people are illiterate, and this is where they get their news. This is also how Boss Tweed is undone. Okay, so what happens actually, and it's he gets arrested. The longer story is Boss Tweed oversteps himself when he upsets the Orange Order. Okay, Thomas Nast, low literacy. In fact, oh, I should mention this too. He tries to bribe. Boss Tweed is so offended by the cartoons of Thomas Nast and the following that he has, and he sees the influence he has, that threatening his Irish control of his Irish voters, that he bribes him with upward. He ends up bribing him $500,000 to leave him alone. Which is an insane amount of money if you think about what that would be today. And Nast turns him down. In any case, Tweed oversteps himself beautifully by refusing to give a permit to the Orange Order to march, so he makes a mistake of not allowing the Orange Parade one year. Now, the Orangemen are a Protestant order, and they would be anti-Catholic, radically anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, right? So you can see why Boss Tweed has to head this way, right, to appease the Irish. And if you do Canadian history, you learn about the Orange Order real fast. The Orange Order, they're involved with Louis Riel in our first, the Métis Rebellion, and Thomas Scott, the guy that Louis Riel killed. You know what? You don't need to, I'm just giving you some context here. Was an Orangeman. Such a hothead, Riel had to have him killed, basically. And that's kind of what the Orangemen are like. They're hotheads. They're anti-Catholic, radically anti-Catholic order. And they want to march. And Tweed sees trouble, and there's no gain for him in this. So he says he doesn't give them a permit. He won't do that for any amount of money. They're upset, and that causes a blowback that he can't contain. Okay, so this is a mistake, and the Orangemen have the sheriff on side. The sheriff of New York sees an opportunity here. He decides enough already, and Boss Tweed gets arrested for graft. Okay, so the sheriff at this point thinks he has enough support because the Orangemen are pretty influential, yeah, so he goes out and arrests Boss Tweed, which is major. Now, Boss Tweed actually escapes. He gets away. Anyway, fact check on this one. It might be that he hears that sheriff is going to arrest him and he tries to get out of Dodge. But he's captured because he's seen by those who have read these cartoons. So he's recognized. His face is recognized, and he doesn't get out of New York City. Ends up being imprisoned, and he dies in prison. That's the end of Boss Tweed. But in the end, he gets convicted of theft, somewhere between 40 and 200 million, which today would be billions, equivalent of billions. Okay, so Tammany Hall corruption, well done, Scorsese. Enough said there. Oh, there's my. Geez, I got to keep up with these. Okay, and the other thing that the film does very well on is its central point, the title, the gangs. Okay, the gangs of New York. And gangs are a huge part of 19th century cities for a very simple reason, that they offer mutual protection in a time when the police offered zero protection. The police should be understood more as a control agency for the wealthy. They ensure the poor do not assault the rich. They keep a lid on them, and there's a long tradition of that in American history for sure. So there are dozens of gangs, and their purpose is not random violence. Their purpose is self-protection in a place of anarchy and mob rule. Okay, and a huge feature of the time. And in fact, 1850, I'll get to this in a sec, 1850, we know from New York City records that there were over 200 gang wars where they're fighting for turf in New York. Okay, there were, they broke down into all sorts of things, but the main divisions between the gangs was immigrant versus nativist. Okay, so there were the immigrant and the nativist gangs, and the dominant among the nativist gangs is the Bowery Boys, and that's what Bill Poole is in, who we'll talk about in a second. The 40 Thieves is another, but there's other anti-immigrant gangs, and then there's the different ethnic gangs that are for the Germans and the Irish, mostly the Irish, and there is a gang called the Dead Rabbits. There's also one called the Roach Guards. There's one called the Shirt Tails, the Chichesters. There is a group called the gang called the Daybreak Boys, and they specialize in stealing from boats on the East River. So just as the film depicts, they have that specialization gangs, and there was. There are some of the stock characters here. The Hellcat Maggie, who's exaggerated in her brutality here, but she is a member of the Dead Rabbits and one of these famous gangbangers from the time. Okay, there's also Bill Poole. Okay, so the model for Daniel Day-Lewis character, Bill Poole, Bill the Butcher, did exist. He was a nativist, and in fact he was a leader in the Know Nothing Party, and this here is the flag of the Know Nothing Party, which is also, it's a political party of the time, which is a nativist anti-Catholic political party, which its actual name was the National American Party. But it gets its name from what you're supposed to say to people when they ask you what the party's up to, right? Because it's kind of like a secret, semi-secret organization, like the Masons. But in any case, so he's a leader in the Know Nothing Party, nativist 100%, and a very colorful guy. He's a bare hands boxer. Who has this tendency to beat his enemies to a complete pulp. There's no evidence he ever killed anyone, but he is killed by his Irish enemy, his Irish nemesis, who's a guy named Morrissey. Now he's not killed when the film he's not killed during the draft riots. He's actually killed in 1855, so before the Civil War even happens, 5 years before the war. But by this Tammany Hall enforcer, Irishman. Okay, whose name is Morrissey. And to give you a sense of the times that we're talking about, this Morrissey guy, this does nothing to damage his political career. In fact, he goes on to be a United States Senator after this. Bill Poole, allegedly, from those witnesses, his last words on being killed by Morrissey were "Goodbye, boys. I die a true American." Okay, so yeah. The film is doing this very, very well. Okay, although it gets the time period wrong, which is fine, right? Now, gangs also, and the film does this, and Brian Palmer talks about this, they also control services, okay? They control services. And one service that they offer, and I mentioned it already, is they are paid by politicians to swing the vote the right way, okay? So that's one thing they do. But they're also paid to put out fires, okay? And one of the biggest issues in American cities at the time is, and this is before public utilities, is fire. Okay, this is the greatest health concern. Actually, it's not cholera. The biggest issue at the time in terms of public health and safety, all right, is fires, not cholera. Fire, and every city has its great fire, and you probably know that. You don't have to walk into any museum in North America and they talk about the Great Fire of, right? Chicago, most of the city burns down in 1871. New York, 1835, 50 acres are burnt up, 700 buildings. Okay, and at that point, that's early on. The 5 Points went on a rampage, looting homes and businesses back in 1835, and so fire is huge, okay? And gangs found a way to make money from that too. There's 37 volunteer firefighting companies in New York in the 1860s run by the gangs for the simple reason that the insurance company would pay out to whoever got to the fire first. And so you have that competition, and the gang would show up with their fire brigade, their gang fire brigade, and put a plug over the barrel till the rest of the gang shows up, exactly as depicted in the film. And in fact, the Bowery Boys are their gang uniform is a fireman's uniform. Okay, So, and this is also a way to get funds. These gangs organizing these fire companies or fire brigades, the money goes to pay for the social life of that company, the party fund. Okay? Plus, if you're in a fire brigade gang, then it's insurance that your house won't get looted, which is also depicted in the film. So, good job there. Okay. Okay, and then there's the police, which depicted very well in the film by John C. Reilly as this character embodiment of corrupt policing, which is 100% accurate. Okay, and in fact, there's also competing police forces. Now, the backstory to all that is there's the municipal police that are in the control of Tammany Hall, and to get on top of them, the New York governor eventually creates the Metropolitan Police, okay, to take them on. Now, before we talk about that, know that, again, police are enforcers, okay? Their function is protecting property of the New Yorkers and keeping a lid on the slum areas like the 5 Points, raising revenue for the mayor's office, the Tammany Ring, and that's what the municipal police in New York were doing, right? Raising money for the Tammany Ring, and the brilliant way they do that is through the Vice Squad, right? And the Vice Squad doesn't operate to shut down Vice, right? But to bring in cash, right? And to actually encourage Vice. So Mayor Wood gets elected on a reform platform the first time he's elected, and he promises he's going to clean up the brothels, he's going to clean up the gambling den, the cockfighting, the gambling dens, the cockfightings, and all the rest of it, and bring in a Sunday closing law, okay, on taverns. But he only does that so that once he's in office, now he can extort from all those thousands of operators in New York, and there are thousands of them. It's give me enough protection money, and the police will not reinforce. It will not enforce your closure, right? So brilliant strategy. That's how the Vice Squad operates at this time under Tammany Hall, the municipal police. But as I said, gets to a point that this force is so fat from graft, so obviously corrupt, that the New York governor declares war, sets up his own state force, and which he named the Metropolitan Police. Their sole purpose is to take on Tammany Hall, and the first thing they do is the New York governor has them file charges against Fernando Wood, and he appoints a state commissioner to go arrest him. The commissioner tries with a bunch of other police. He comes with a phalanx of them to Mayor Wood's municipal hall, the city hall, but his police are waiting, right? And the municipal police jump on the Metropolitan Police and the commissioner, literally as they're trying to drag Wood out of the building. And what ensues from that moment is this surreal conflict known as the police riots of 1857, where you have, and it just spirals from there, where they never do get Wood. At this point anyway, and the cops are battling. They're for about a month. They're raiding each other's jails. Actually, they're canceling each other's arrests, and the gangs have a field day. Right, the gangs have a field day, and the culmination of that is it ends in this massive Irish versus nativist battle, which is known as the Dead Rabbits Riot. Okay. So the attempted arrest ends in the Dead Rabbits Riot of 1857, where about 10 people are killed. It's a 2-day riot between the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys, okay? And it's put down by the New York militia eventually. So that is analogous to this massive riot as seen in the film, but it happens through the police riots of 1857. Again, has nothing to do with the draft, and it's off by a few years. As for the mayor, the state eventually gets the upper hand, but it takes an entire platoon of National Guardsmen to get him arrested. And then he manages to get off in court, and he's back as mayor 2 years later. At that point, he's trying to get to New York to secede from the Union during the Civil War. Okay, so he's back as mayor 2 years later after this attempt to have him brought down by the governor. Through this separate police force. He's back in politics, back as mayor, and during the Civil War plays that important role. He knows that New Yorkers are not in favor of the war, and he's trying to get secession from the Union as a city, which makes no sense, but have New York go its own way as a free and independent city, and that doesn't end up happening, as you probably might have guessed. Okay, so corruption of municipal police force, though, and their links to organized crime and with gangs is one of the most enduring themes in American history. Uh, and uh, and also this theme of an extra jurisdictional force that's required to deal with it, right? And as we see in this story, right? And this idea of a federal police having to go after corrupt municipal police. This is largely why in 1908 Teddy Roosevelt establishes the Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, right? He's a progressive reformer going after, and the FBI's job really is largely to go after these corrupt municipal police forces. And we get out of that, we get J. Edgar Hoover with his 48-year war on gangsters, right, and corrupt police departments. If you've seen that movie, Johnny Depp as John Dillinger, Public Enemies, right? Um, it's about that. Bureau of Prohibition, Elliot Ness's Untouchables, right, versus the corrupt Chicago police. Okay, so a real theme. Don't worry about knowing all that. Obviously, I'm just telling you there is this strong theme, and what this story here, metropolitan versus municipal police, gets gives us a sense of that. Okay. Oh, sorry. Here's our depiction, and this is actually not Thomas Nast. This is another illustrated news magazine of the time showing us that massive dead rabbits riot of 1857. Okay, and again, we'll talk more police corruption when we do Changeling and look at which the LAPD and police corruption later in American history. Okay. Okay, and the final theme I want to give you and talk about before we get into the theses is the slums. Okay, and one of the best things about this film is a reminder of the 19th century, a very different world that we wouldn't recognize, and that's especially true of the urban slums. And if anything, they are far worse than what Scorsese can give us here, manages to depict. And the gangs, in fact, is slums light, but still a good reminder of what cesspools, slums in big North American cities are like at this time. Okay? And and places like the Five Points, which are not unique. We have our own places like that. We have the Swamp in Montreal and Griffintown in Toronto, but New York rivals all of them. Okay, in fact, it's better than even London, which was seen to be for a long time the worst. And we have that from no less of an expert than Charles Dickens himself. Okay, who came to New York and was shocked and disgusted by the hideous tenements. He came in 1842, and he wrote a book about it called American Notes. Charles Dickens, and he said he was completely impressed by this world of vice and misery. And this is notably before the Irish potato famine and before these hordes of thousands of starving Irish pour in and make it much worse. Many of them don't make it. They die on the ships coming over. That's how brutal that time is. Right, and that by that point you'd have several hundred squatters living in the old brewery. Okay, so North American cities this era, the slum eras, were violent. They're miserable. They're disease-ridden, and the density is massive. Right, New York is the worst in North America. Boston is second at 80 people per acre. New York has 135, which is hard to get your head around. It is packed, and in terms of public services do not run to slum areas, okay, which also tend to be built in the worst places. Swamp, Montreal, say no more. And in Manhattan, the Five Points and is right next to the Bowery Street, and it was built on the old Collect Pond, which is where back in the days when New York was New Amsterdam, the Dutch would dump their waste. Okay, and so hodgepodge ad hoc building happens here for squatting settlements and then more permanent buildings, but they're sinking, literally sinking into the ground over time because of what they're built on top of. A swamp, right, which became a dump. So swamp and dump. In fact, places like the Five Points are so bad that the middle class would take these escorted tours and go slumming. And they'd be equipped with kerchiefs to keep off the stench, as depicted in the film. And the stench is bad, and partly that's because, as I said, the public utilities don't run here, so sewers don't run to these parts of cities. They go to where people pay for them, and that means that collection of human waste is random and episodic. As when it happens, it happens with where people put out buckets, and farmers from neighboring districts will come into the city at night and collect them, and that's called night soil. They use it for fertilizer in their fields, if you can believe that. That was at best case this would happen, but often didn't. So you end up with sewage running into your water, right? And because there's no main water system that you're hooked to, you simply have a well. And that well is generally in a place like Soho in London. One communal tap there set off this massive cholera epidemic that killed thousands of people, included Karl Marx as one of his children. Okay, so that's what could happen, and that kind of thing happened in New York as well. You'd have a communal tap that would service an entire area, but the water is contaminated. And because of cholera and other diseases people didn't understand about transmission, one person sick using a communal water tap, and pretty soon you have these big outbreaks. Okay? Now, these cities at that time were somewhat organic in that a lot of these poor city dwellers kept animals. A lot of them kept pigs, and those pigs would eat the waste, and that was a way of recycling. Before landfills existed. And there were horses. Now, horses were actually a problem, and that only becomes worse with time as urbanization takes off post-Civil War. But already a problem in this time period, because what you have is the average working horse defecates 35 pounds a day, which is an enormous amount because they're working hard and eating a lot, and that gets ground down by wheels of wagons and ends up in the air that you breathe, right? So the manure crisis is really post-Civil War when the numbers of horses increases and urbanization takes off, but it's already a problem now. Enough that the streets of New York in these areas they're described as characterized by corporation pudding because they're not paved, and we end up with the elements, and then the sewage and the horse manure and the rest. We get this sludge that sometimes can be up to your knees trying to get through that. It sounds like an exaggeration, but it's not. So this is what the slums are like at the time. They're brutal. Brutal enough for the middle class to come and do slumming tours, and other middle class to come and enjoy the entertainments here, which I'll get to in a sec. But that's what these are. Actually, I'll get to them now. And Jacob Rice, who's a reformer later on, writes a book in 1890 called How the Other Half Lives, a very important book that casts a light on what's going on in these areas. So this is later, and problems are bigger. But he counts almost 8,000 saloons in New York at the time, 10-to-1 over churches, and gambling halls and dance halls and bars and cockfighting is common, and so yeah, just not pleasant places. Okay? And maybe this doesn't surprise you, but there's a lot that you can read on this, okay, about North American cities at the time if you want to know more. Here's what one Methodist minister in the time period that the film is set in gives us about the 5 points. He calls it the synonym. The 5 points is a synonym for ignorance, the most entire misery, the most abject crime of the darkest type, degradation so deep that human nature cannot sink beneath it. One of the things that the middle class find fascinating, and here I have a list here of what's all going on there: rat baiting, cockfighting, pugilism, gambling, dance halls, is the racial mixing, okay? And that's something that the film gives us as well, and that's what middle class and upper class New Yorkers will notice, right? This is the spot where black and white promiscuously mingle and nightly celebrate disgusting orgies, okay? And there's a bit of prurience here, definitely, so. And it's not just in the form of slumming tours, it's also in the form of middle class and affluent New Yorkers coming down to these districts to take advantage and find autonomy, pursuing vices that they can't in their society, right, on the sly. And And we know now from reading, Palmer, that whole he/she thing, that we don't have examples, we don't have any evidence that there's a transgender culture in New York during the Civil War, but we do know that exists shortly after that. At least by 1890, we know there's about half a dozen gay brothels in New York among the thousands of taverns and brothels that exist there. Okay, so and Caleb Carr, he wrote a book called The Alienist, and it's been made into a television series, and it examines this dark underworld, and he focuses in that book, or one of his characters is James T. Ellison, who's this fascinating Tammany Hall gangster who may well have been homosexual, but at least has one of his half dozen or so taverns is a gay brothel. Okay, so we know that this culture exists, and there's a transgender culture. The term homosexual doesn't exist till the 1880s, but we do have what are called these painted boys that would be available for you in these places. Okay, so Scorsese gives us this. It's out of step with the time, but we know it exists shortly after, within a generation, and there's every reason to believe there probably was gay brothels much earlier than that, uh, and that's because we know of that from careful research and going much further back into the in Europe and in other places. In any case, here's Joseph Pulitzer talking in the 1890s about one of these gay brothels owned by Frank Stevenson called The Slide. Okay, so it is as George Chauncey points out, if you want to read more about this, he has an important book that came out in 1995 about gay New York, gender, urban culture, the making of the gay male world there, from 1890 to 1940. And it's interesting how non-linear that is, because it kind of disappears by the 20s and 30s. Okay, it becomes very, very active and visible for a time, and then goes away, which is counterintuitive to what most students of history believe. Okay, so Scorsese, yes, American City. Slums is another good theme, and it's a foreign country to us, and he reminds us of that. Okay, so Scorsese does a good job giving us a corrective of our sanitized view of the times, and even though he's exaggerating it, we can let him get away with that, because he is slapping our face, so to speak, and saying, "Look here, I'm ramping it up." As did Asbury, but it was much more interesting than you remember, much more colorful, much more violent. Okay, and I want to get to his thesis, and that's where we're going next in the lecture. And my thesis on it is there's a limitation to this kind of bottom-up history. And what I want to give you is that what I see in Scorsese, by pointing his camera right at the epicenter of the worst places, right in one of the most violent times in the American story, is he misses the bird's eye perspective, which is equally important. Okay, now if you're committed, like a Marxist historian or Brian Palmer or Howard Zinn, to radically bottom up history, you'll say I'm wrong. That this is the view. The view is from the bottom up, and that's sufficient because history is conflict, and class conflict is the engine that drives history. Okay, but from my perspective, there's real limitations here, and the limitation is in the bird's eye view of things, that you lose even I think, and I think the film does, what matters most, where the real story is. Who are the real agents of change in this time? And that's really all that history is, the study of change through time, right? And I don't think the film gives us a satisfying answer to that question, okay? And that's because he doesn't give us the bird's eye view. Okay, let's look at his theses again. This era was a cauldron of conflict and violence out of which New York and this country were created. Really? Well, how? Right? Look at the end of the film. Scorsese has to acknowledge, and to his credit, he does, that change is constant, but we get this super dissatisfying ending. I mean, it's an epic ending. It's one of the best endings of film of all time. You get this amazing song by U2 playing, and you see New York rising up through the 20th century, right up until the Twin Towers, which incidentally came down the year that the film was in the editing stage. So we know change has been massive since then, but the film does nothing to explain it, and the song title, it just really, it's almost like a parody, because it couldn't be more inappropriate. The hands that built America. Well, who built America? Right? Was it these gangsters? Well, but no. At the same time, he's saying we were mightily swept away. We killed each other, right? And it's almost like the film confirms what Schermerhorn says, quoting Jay Gould, the robber baron, to Horace Greeley in the film, where he says, "I can always hire half the working class to kill the other half," and this seems to have validated that, right? So where does change then come from? It's very unclear. And in fact, right, the violence doesn't bring change, it brings reaction, repression, and Amsterdam even says as much. He says it's the opposite. Every year the reformers came, every year the points got worse. Okay, so not only is not change coming, the change that we do see verified in the end of the film, but things are continually worsening. Okay, as in the film, the draft rights are suppressed, the immigrant loses, the marginalized stays marginal, the war continues to its conclusion, and the rich boys stay home, the poor boys die in the battlefield. That's the message. And here's the thing. This is exactly where Marx would land. Okay, this is what you would call the doctrine of increasing misery, the Marxist doctrine of increasing misery, and that's where bottom-up history is situated in that Marxist analysis, where we end up with it. We can't really figure out why change actually happened, because we're certainly not living in the New York of the draft riots. That New York is gone, right? You cannot make an argument that's in any case in any way analogous to where we're at today. In as much as students love to say things are terrible today when they write their essays, and racism has never been so bad. No, it was way worse. People were being lynched, okay, by the thousands. No, things are far better today. So how did that change happen? Okay? And Marx says it doesn't, right? And that's where the left lands, okay? The greater the social wealth, the greater is the mass of a consolidated surplus population, the greater is the official paupers. And this is the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation. This is in Marx' Das Kapital. Marx's life story is a great, tragic case study of ahistoricism, of the fact that he can't explain change, right, and didn't understand it. Okay? Karl Marx spends 35 years in his life on this book, Das Kapital, which he never pulls together, because he ends up dying with about 1,000 pages of notes, and his friend Engels pulls it together, and it's almost incomprehensible, because he really didn't understand how capitalism worked. But in any case, the problem is that Marx is working backwards from something he came to as a teenager, this idea that global revolution is coming, right? And because the conditions of the working class are continually deteriorating under capitalism. The conditions of the working class are always getting worse, right? And many people still believe that, right? But if that's the case, then how do you explain the fact, Carl, that during your lifetime, the conditions of the working class are increasingly getting better, and that global revolution you want or you expect is receding further and further all the time, right? Well, he says these people are revolutionary cannon fodder, the ones that are tweaking the system. They're making the bars gold, right? The gilded cage, right? But that revolution will come, because the conditions of the working class are continually getting worse under capitalism. Okay, and that's the tragedy of Marx's life, that he has to deny what is actually happening in his own time. And this gets me to the weakness of this film and many others like it, in that from my point of view, the least interesting people in the movie are actually the real agents of change. Okay, the least interesting people in the film are actually the real agents of change. Okay, and that's the moral reformers, okay? The ones who run the old brewery when Amsterdam gets out of prison. When the movie begins, the old brewery is habituated by the 5 Point district slummers and squatters, and it's a vivid and an exciting place. With caverns that don't exist and yada yada, but that doesn't matter. But in any case, that's true. It was, and it is true that it gets taken over by the moral reformers. And when he gets out of jail, they are the ones that were running the old brewery. They host these silly dances, and they're completely out of place, and they're ineffective, but they're good for comic value. Okay, but maybe, just maybe, they're the agents of change in this time. Okay, so I'm going to show you a bit of clip from a really good PBS documentary next, and then we'll unpack that a bit more. I tried about 4 or 5, maybe 6 different ways to get this video to embed as I turn it into an MP4, and nothing seems to work. So what I'm just going to do is I'll just explain it to you, and I'll also encourage you to go look at it. So if you go under YouTube, PBS Frontline God in America, '01 A New Adam, there's the URL for it. But in any case, it's look at the section from 112 to 114.10. That's exactly what I'm about to paraphrase. And but it does it in a magical a well polished documentary way with a couple of great talking heads. But what it gets at is that America's had this massive transformation called the Great Awakening, and that has shifted the religious conscience of most Americans from being a religion of piety, which is the old Puritan churches on the coast, the Congregational Anglican, the conservative ones, to evangelicalism, which is much more activist, and it's about not just saving others, but saving America itself, making it into the kind of place that Jesus would want to come back to. And a lot of them believe he will come back when we create this perfect society here. Okay? And so you've got one guy, Stephen Prothero. I just love this guy. He's awesome. He's written a book called The American Jesus, and he talks about how important it is, this culture of Christianizing society, but not just about conversion. He points out, right? It's about making America into the kind of place that Jesus would want it to be, and this new awareness, this awakening up to the fact that there's kind of something funny about the way we do our prisons. There's something strange about slavery. There's something wrong about women not having the vote, right? There's something wrong even about segregation of the races, because what happens in the Great Awakening increasingly is integration between races to some extent. Okay, so these kind of questioning of values is happening, but and then we have so I hope you watch it, because Cynthia Lyerly is just fantastic in this one, and she talks about how she says, you walk into any town in America in the 1830s, and you will see evangelicals that are probably running the orphanage. You'll see evangelicals that are in the prison, making sure that the prisoners are well cared for, right? You'll see evangelicals in the poorhouse taking care of the poor. You'll see evangelicals getting rid of drink and getting rid of the town tavern. Okay, and all these things. And then the documentary shows that just a long list of agencies that are coming about out of this energy that evangelicals have at this point. Okay, so that is the point, that this kind of reshaping, and that these really are the agents of change in this time period. And here's the thing, that this Protestant movement is just wildly successful. Okay, it culminates in everything from the 16th to the 19th Amendment, from the Income Tax Act to women's voting. Okay, and we have it here in our film. We have the moral reformers in our film, and there's the sideshow. Okay, and the Ladies' Home Missionary Society, and they do set up in New York. This is exactly accurate. They come to the 5 points in 1848, and they came to convert sinners and teach them the errors of their Catholic ways, okay, because they're concerned about Catholicism. And if you watch more of the God in America thing, you'll see that is a real subtext here, a real important theme among this Protestant vision for America, right? This fear of Catholicism, right? That's papacy has no future in America and should not. Okay, so there is that, right? But they don't really connect here until they hire this really energetic missionary. They don't connect with the people in the 5 points. And in fact, there's this great quote that they give us that comes down through time from one of these women, and she says that in their services, she said that those who attended, she never saw a more vivid representation of hell, or they were a more vivid representation of hell than I had ever imagined, which is awesome, and it's exactly what Scorsese has successfully given us. Okay, but yeah, this is their class divide from these people they've come to convert. In any case, they're starting to learn the hard way that their methods are kind of inadequate, and they hire a guy named Louis Pease. And in fact, there's an article about their 5 points mission a few years down the road, but they hire this energetic Lewis Pease, and he's a super important figure in American history for really inventing the what he calls the House of Industry, which is a settlement house model, which will then be taken up by many others, including famously Jane Addams in Chicago, right? Hull House, if maybe you've heard of Jane Addams. But in any case, they hire Lewis Pease, and he he comes with the attitude that what these women need and what this primarily women, but the people in the 5 points that they're trying to minister to, they need a hand up more than they need a sermon. So what he does is he provides them with employment, and specifically sewing shirts, okay, which then can be sold technically, but they're so poorly made that they're not. So he can't but sell many of them. But what he does is he takes in prostitutes, he'll take in street workers, he'll take in anyone and give them a job, and funded through the Ladies Home Missionary Society, and teach them a skill, teach them a craft, right? And so it's basically rehab, because they can't drink well on the job, so it's rehabilitation. And this also leads to a settlement house model of residences for the inner city homeless. And the home missionary ladies also, with Lewis Pease, they actually purchased the old brewery. So in the film, the old brewery is the one Amsterdam came to, anyway, we talked about it already, right? But yeah, they purchased it in order to demolish it. Okay, so it's not about how it's depicted in the film. It doesn't become an actual settlement house. But this model that Lewis Pease initiates just takes off, okay? Within 5 years of this House of Industry in New York, there are 445 like them across America. 445 more. Enormous change, right? These people are bringing radical change and radical transformation in this time, and that's again due to the fact that the religious landscape, has been radically transformed earlier. Okay, so and this is just the beginning. There's much more going on. Much of this going on. Okay, there's all sorts of reform taking place at this time, and here's a bunch of examples that I'll just give you. Okay, civic reform. Okay, you got evangelicals that are reforming cities. They reforming civic politics and introducing the secret ballot in place of the ward system, which threatens Tammany Hall. Okay, reform is a consistent threat to Tammany Hall until it's finally gotten rid of. You got the actual civic reform that's cleaning up the city. You got George Warren, the civic reformer, who takes on that project, and soon enough the corporation pudding is a thing of the past. You have movements towards safety and towards what we finally get with the Factory Act. You also have civic reformers that are trying to bring in safety standards for buildings, and out of that we get the dumbbell tenement by James Ware. He comes up with this design. So by 1867, you get the nation's first tenement law that comes out of these kind of reformers. Okay, a tenement law which says that every bedroom in any given building, must have a window, a means of egress, right? So initially what developers are doing, or what these tenement builders are doing, is they're putting windows on interior walls that don't go anywhere until that gets tightened up, the language of that act, and then the dumbbell tenement comes out of it. Unfortunately, it's designed so that fires, people throw a lot of garbage down in the middle, and so you have fires shooting up, and it doesn't ultimately help all that much, but in any case, we're on the right track, right? You also get things like Frances Willard with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, fighting for temperance, fighting for the vote, for female suffrage, okay? And many other female reformers that take on that cause. You get Thomas Sullivan, who's this missionary to mariners, and he creates the first YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association in America, so that they have something to do other than these idle pursuits when they're in the city. And that first one is in Boston, and then we have them all over the United States and Canada. As well as in the UK. The orphan train system. This is there's about 30,000 homeless children in New York before Charles Loring Brace sets up the Children Aid Society, okay? And he invents what's called he invents the foster care system with what are called the orphan trains, where he's finding homes for these children out in farm families where they're probably exploited and but in any case, and there's all sorts of critiques about what these people are doing. They're class bound and race bound and trespassing on in some ways on women's autonomy, right? But that's to be expected, right? They are setting America on a different path, a new way. Okay, and so they're the energy. They're the ones that we have to pay attention to, which in this film are the ones on the out. Oh, by the way, there's our tenements in New York today, right? Based on James Ware's winning design. Okay, and abolition movement itself and the Civil War itself is an idea. Okay, so the very setting of this film, the Civil War, is thanks to thanks to these evangelical moral reformers who at one point were a tiny minority in the United States at about 5%. Were these activist religious zealots who were in the abolitionist movement, but they slowly get more and more Americans on board, right? And we could do a whole lecture on this, but I don't have time. But Harriet Beecher Stowe is a big name here with her Uncle Tom's Cabin, which wins a lot of hearts and minds, and she is a radical religious zealot. So is William Lloyd Garrison. He's the biggest name in the abolitionist movement. He's in there for decades and almost loses his life because of it, and absolutely a religious zealot. And he makes those bridges with guys with Frederick Douglass, who's our main man when it comes on the African American freedom movement from that side, right? So these these zealots, and I'm not even mentioning John Brown yet, whom I've already talked about with you in a previous lecture. But nobody convinces the South more than John Brown that war is inevitable and must happen, right? And absolutely a religious zealot if ever there was one. Okay, with his attempted slave insurrection, invasion of the South, and his Kansas Civil War. In any case. What they have in common, they're absolutely convinced what they're doing is the Lord's work, and their agenda is chock full of religious language. Okay, and the other thing that you have to pay attention to here, and this is where bottom-up history has a big gap, is that it's economic reductionist. It says if you follow the money, you can explain everything, but you cannot explain the Civil War by following the money. And in fact, most of the battles that reformers are fighting, especially something like good government, is fought for against the interests of the wealthy. And there's no better example of that than the Civil War itself, which is a brutal battle that's incredibly expensive both in lives and the fact that it destroys an economically viable system, not just a viable system, but a system by which all Americans benefited enormously, both North and South. And there's a great expression from that goes back to Calhoun, this politician, South Carolina senator in the 1840s, that slavery is a combination of the lords of the lash and the lords of the loom. Okay, by which he means it's not just the lords of the lash, which is the plantation owners, but the lords of the loom, which is industry in the North, which is textile mills, and insurance companies and everything, right? Stockholding ventures and whatever, everything, the economy of the North. It's not just an economy with slavery, it's a slave economy, and that's more and more the case for all of America the closer we get to 1860. So Americans are going out of their way to destroy a very viable system, okay, and a very wealthy system. Had the South been a nation in 1860, it would have been the 5th biggest economy on earth. And most of the pre-war, the antebellum presidents come from the South. So yeah, it is true to some extent. You follow the money, follow the power, right? But then there are limits. Ideas trump economic reductionism at this point for sure, and they often do in history. Okay, and a bottom-up historian will not give any credence to ideas because they're not. You cannot quantify them financially. Right, but you certainly can quantify that war. It cost $2.5 million per day, $6 billion by the end, which would have been trillions in today's money. And by the end of the war, inflation is running at 9,000% in the South, and it's ruinous in the North as well. Not that bad, but it's bad, right? And then 10,400 military engagements, 600,000 deaths, and but the point being, big investment here to destroy an economically viable system based on an idea, right, that slavery should have no future in America, and based on a man. And that's the thing too about bottom-up history. It rejects the idea of great men, right? Because it stands in opposition to the antiquarian history, the older history that put that great men only, right? And this is what Howard Zinn and his type are reacting to: great men history, great white men history. But there are some great men, and there are definitely men in place in certain points in time that are operating out of religiously or spiritually or idea-based values, right? Who make a difference in history, and Abraham Lincoln is absolutely an example of that. And I've already defended that and explained how he completely changes the direction of the war from non-extension of slavery to the abolition of slavery, and commits utterly to that, right? And comes to this idea that this big debt that we're paying in this war that's so expensive and so brutal and has seen so much death is our payment for what we did to the slaves. Now that's a profound idea, and that's what energizes him. Okay? So bottom-up history is limited, is maybe as much as I'm saying. And that's my point. Conflict and violence ultimately don't explain much at all at the end of the day. And you see the problem at the end of the film. The film can't resolve itself. We're forgotten. If this is the furnace out of which America is forged, if class conflict is the engine of history, then why are they forgotten, and who actually changed anything here, right? But yeah, it's ideas that matter. Ideas do change history, and they're, in some ways, they're neither bottom up or top down. In some ways they're outside of it. Okay? But if we allow for the idea that there maybe were some great men and women in the past, they had agency, they could, animated by their ideas, activated by their ideas, foresaw and could make and did make a better America, a better world. Okay. Anyway, that's my lecture, and it's quite a long one, I think. I don't even know how long it is now, but I guess I'll find out when I close it. And yeah, I welcome you to challenge me on it, or whatever, or questions, let me know. And I hope it was interesting. All right, take care. Thanks for listening.